This is not a one and done kind of attack. Iranian proxies in the area are numerous and robust. Frankly, as I mentioned, it's about time, it's well past time that the United States signify the importance of responding to the kinds of aggression that its forces are facing in the region.
Yeah. I want to hear about some of the choices that the Pentagon made here, General, knowing that you flew the F-15. We saw B-1s fly around the world from bases here in the U.S. to take part in that initial strike on Friday. Saw the Navy get involved with F-18s off the USS Eisenhower over the course of the weekend. Some cruise missiles have been used here. What do you make about the selections of hardware? How effective was it?
Well, first, the military commands in the region are still assessing impact. But if you look at the use of the B-1, which many people are wondering, well, why did he do that and launch it from the United States? I'd tell you that first, it induced a degree of surprise with respect to adversaries in the region. Second, it's an aircraft that has a very large precision payload. In other words, it can drop many weapons from one platform and stay airborne for long periods of time. And finally, it also signaled that the United States can project power without local basing. Our US-based bombers can reach anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. It doesn't take weeks or months to do so. So, by the way, as you mentioned over the weekend, but even on that strike on Friday, the B-1s were not the only aircraft that were used. U.S. Air Force aircraft are deployed to the Middle East, and they were also part of the attacks that you saw on Friday.
Well, Lieutenant General, you mentioned the projection of power on the part of the U.S. How much power is projected if the signal being sent is that the U.S. is reluctant to directly strike Iran in its own territory? Is the U.S. giving too much away here in terms of what it is not willing to do, what power it will not utilize?
Kailey, that's a wonderful question. Let me speak for a moment about deterrence. And let me remind your audience that the way one deters a wider war is not by saying that you don't want a wider war or that we won't strike inside Iran, but by making sure Iran understands that if they and their proxies continue attacks on U.S. personnel, then they can expect disastrous consequences. In other words, deterrence is achieved by instilling in the minds of the Iranian leadership sufficient uncertainty of achieving their objectives so that they decide not to continue their attacks due to the potential consequences. So I'm afraid that attacks on U.S. forces in the region won't stop until Iran understands that their critical interests are at stake. So the administration has to stop telling our enemies what the U.S. is not going to do, is that only will encourage them to continue their attacks. So I got to tell you, it's very frustrating. And frankly, the kind of attacks you saw on Friday and follow on the weekend are ones that should have been conducted when attacks against U.S. forces commenced back last year. That would have increased the probability of deterring the 4 months of attacks on U.S. forces since then.
Well, are you taking them at their word here? We were speaking with Michael Knights a couple of days ago, General. He said we are out of rungs on the escalation ladder. If this doesn't work in, say, a couple of weeks and we're still playing with this, is a strike against Iran out of the question?
Well, no, it shouldn't be out of the question. And quite frankly, as I just said, we shouldn't be telling or telegraphing what we may or may not be doing. What I'd tell you is that actions directly against Iran will be fundamental to halt their continued aggression and the aggression by their clients. Now, that action can take many forms. It can be lethal, non-lethal, economic, diplomatic, deterrent, or a combination of all of these. And while I don't want to get into specifics in terms of what I would target, because all that does is aid the Iranians, I believe that it would be wise to initiate full up sanctions on Iran against all forms of their economic income, particularly their oil exports, and then, if necessary, direct attacks against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership, their key essential systems which allow them to function, their infrastructure, their personnel, and their deployed forces. And again, without getting into specifics, those are some general areas that Iran needs to be put on notice, are liable to be struck, and that may have the effect of deterring the Iranians. But we also have to be ready to back up these statements. So we're not, I mean, Michael's a friend of mine, but I have to tell you, no, we're not anywhere close to getting to the last rung in the escalation ladder.
Well, of course, when we're thinking about rungs and ladders here, there is the ladder in terms of how financing from Iran goes to these different proxy groups. As we talk here about deterring Iran, are we assuming that the connection between Iran and its proxies are strong enough that that directly translates? Or is there a certain degree of control that Tehran, even if it decided it wanted to, cannot exercise over some of these groups?
And again, another great question. The short answer is complex, but that's why I said that with respect to deterrence, we have to keep the issue of actions directly against the government of Iran on the table. Only when they understand that their critical interests are threatened will they pull back the throttles on the aggression that they may, in fact, be orchestrating.